So I think we have an excellent lineup of speakers and talks, and I'm really looking forward to the next 2 days. And I think we couldn't have done better than getting our initial keynote speaker to kick this off. Dr. Jeff Norris is the Mission Operations Innovation Lead at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. So that's a really long title, but what it means to me is that he gets to play with spacecraft and robots and get paid. That's like, come on, that's pretty cool. So I'd like to welcome our first keynote speaker, Dr. Jeff Norris. Everybody, how about a round of applause?
Thanks, Frank. Thanks a lot for that introduction. And I'm more than just a little bit jealous about the whole Google Fiber thing, by the way. I actually grew up in Wichita, Kansas, so not terribly far from here. Someone else? That's weird. That's really random. She and I know what we're talking about, right? It's funny because Kansas City was always the mysterious big city that, sometimes my friends would go there and I would ask questions about Kansas City, and it seemed so amazing, so cool to be there. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to talk about mission-critical innovation. And I want there to be two things that you think about when I say that, two sort of key takeaways from this. I'm going to just put the punchline at the beginning on this one. First, that innovation is absolutely critical in our business. There is no more important quality that I can think of. Innovation is what defines markets, what differentiates products, what will ultimately separate a successful company or endeavor from a dismal failure. It's not the only thing I want you to think of when you hear that phrase, though. I want you to also think that even when we're working in mission-critical circumstances, we have to be innovative. We can't shy away from it, even if the future of our project, the success of our company, perhaps our entire livelihood or the lives of others depend on what we do. We must still be innovative, something which I think is a little more subtle and a little bit more controversial than the first point. Now, it's fine to just say those things, right? I could put a slide up there with some pretty bullet points, and maybe that would emphasize it. But honestly, I don't think you would remember that. Also, it certainly wasn't bullet-pointed slides that convinced me of those things. It was experience, not just my own, but the experiences of others, which were captured in some amazing stories. Stories that I'm going to share with you this morning. 3 stories in all. Stories about risk, about vision, and about failure. And I'm going to make one more promise to you this morning. 45 minutes and no bullet points. So let's get started. For my first story, I'm going to go back a bit. The first story is about vision. It's about that amazing quality to imagine something that doesn't exist in the world, to understand the impact that it could have, to create that impact, to bring it about. I'm going to talk first about the birth of the internet. Only I'm not going to talk about Vint Cerf and Tim Berners-Lee. I'm going to go back a little bit earlier than that, to 1490, to a monk. This monk is standing in a field in Paris, and it's a beautiful day outside, and he's happy to be out in the sunshine, enjoying the weather. He's a little confused, though, because he's been called away from his morning prayers to stand in this field and asked to hold these wires in either hand very tightly, these heavy iron wires. Now, he's further confused by the fact that along with him are dozens of his closest associates, also from the monastery, people that he lives in and works with, and they've also been asked to come and stand in this field. And there's a monk and a wire, a monk and a wire, a monk and a wire, and they're each holding the ends of these wires. They kind of make a giant monk network around this field. So he's stayed quiet so far because at the beginning and the end of the monk network is his boss, the Abbot Jean-Antoine Nollet. But as Abbot Jean-Antoine Nollet begins to raise his own wires, the beginning and end of the monk network, over two very ominous-looking jars, our monk can no longer keep his silence, but to no avail, because what he does not realize is that he is an unwitting participant in one of the first experiments of electricity. And they all shout and jolt at the same time. And in this instant, Jean-Antoine Nollet has learned a couple very important things about electricity. First, because all of his monks jumped and shouted at the same time, electricity appears to travel very quickly and may be useful for communication. Second, and this is a really important tip for all of us to take back home, which is that if you're a little short on materials, it turns out that monks make decent voltage detectors. Just pro tip. Now, it's going to take a while before the experiments, if you want to call it that, of people like Jean-Antoine Nollet would come to bring about a practical communication device. It's going to take the work of people like Baron von Schilling, Carl Gauss, and this man, Samuel Morse. Samuel Morse, who is credited with the creation of what is at least the first commercially successful telegraph, although there were a great many other people working on it at the time, and that's going to be a common theme in this part of the talk. Samuel Morse, when he held his invention in his hand, when he sent the very first long-distance telegraph, I think realized that he was about to change the world. Because his words in his first telegraph were, "What hath God wrought?" Now, he probably was not thinking about YouTube and silly cat videos, but I will point out that every time we tweet, every time we text, we are still sending telegraphs today. Samuel Morse's invention lives on in our pockets. Now, the telegraph of the time was a miraculous invention, but it had a couple of very big problems. The first problem is that it was completely controlled by a monopoly. The Western Union Telegraph Company held the telegraph industry of the United States in a stranglehold. But even they knew they had a problem, which is that the telegraph of the time could only send one message in either direction at a time. So forget bandwidth, forget Google Fiber for a moment, and think of one single message traveling on a wire in either direction at a time. Now, the Western Union Telegraph Company had a hunch that this was not an insurmountable difficulty, that someone might be able to create a multiple telegraph, and they had a pretty good idea, which was they just let it be known that any organization, any individual who could invent a multiple telegraph would be richly rewarded by the Western Union Telegraph Company. This created something of a frenzy amongst the inventors of the time, and one of the people who was swept up in that initial frenzy is the hero of our first story, Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander, known, of course, popularly as at least the creator of the first commercially successful telephone, though there were many other people working on it at the time. That's not where he started. And I want to dispel an important misconception you may have about this gentleman. You may be thinking about Alexander Graham Bell as a well-to-do aristocrat experimenting with the telephone in a little building off in the corner of his estate. That is not this man. This is a dirt-poor immigrant from Scotland who is working very hard just to try to make ends meet. He has no formal training in matters of telegraphy, certainly not in telephones. He is the dark horse for this race to invent the telegraph. No one even knows him. He certainly had his competition cut out for him in the likes of Thomas Edison, Elisha Gray. Thomas Edison, by this point, already well on his way to being known as the Wizard of Menlo Park, highly experienced in the telegraph industry. Elisha Gray trained in the earliest stages of electrical engineering and directly funded by the Western Union Telegraph Company. These are the guys who are supposed to win this race. Just really a question of which one's going to get there first. However, Alexander Graham Bell has one thing that these two gentlemen do not, and that is his father, Alexander Melville Bell. Now, Alexander Melville Bell is an inventor, a creator in his own right. He had devoted his attention to something else, this. And this is a system for teaching deaf people to speak called visible speech. Why did Alexander Melville Bell do this? Well, Alexander Graham Bell's mother, Alexander Melville Bell's wife, was deaf. And so sound and hearing, and the lack of hearing, permeated the Alexander Graham Bell household from his earliest years. And I believe that it is that knowledge and that experience that ultimately led to the creation of his greatest invention, not the things that his competitors had. Can't come to there just yet, because to get there, Alexander Graham Bell needed something that he had almost nothing of, which was money. That would come from this gentleman, Gardiner Hubbard. Now, Gardiner Hubbard is a well-to-do Boston businessman who has a problem of his own. He wants to start a telegraph company in the presence of a monopoly controlled by the Western Union Company. Starting a company, technology company, in the presence of a monopoly is not an easy thing to do, and it may be something that some of you have some direct experience with. He had a realization that the fastest way to beat the Western Union Telegraph Company would be to beat them to the invention of the multiple telegraph. Unfortunately, the Western Union Company had already swept up all of the good inventors, leaving him with pretty much no options. He meets Alexander Graham Bell through the most unlikely of routes, through his daughter, Mabel Hubbard. You see, Mabel Hubbard was also deaf. And Alexander Graham Bell was making ends meet by teaching at a school for the deaf. Gardiner Hubbard is surprised and delighted to learn that his daughter's tutor has more than a passing interest in telegraph matters and offers to fund him directly to create the multiple telegraph. This is where it begins. Now, I have been a bit tricky here because I'm afraid that this darling girl, this is not what Mabel Hubbard looked like when Alexander Graham Bell met her. No. She, in fact, looked a little bit more like that. And this beautiful young lady was going to become something of a complication. Now, the stage is set for an amazing drama at this moment in Alexander Graham Bell's life. It is a drama that is played out in a series of letters and telegraphs that have been faithfully preserved by the Library of Congress. Letters, by the way, that I believe have handwriting that might as well be encryption. So, on your behalf, I have pored over these letters, transcribed some of them, to try to piece together the amazing drama of this moment in Alexander Graham Bell's life, because it is under the greatest and most intense of pressures that he reaches his point of greatest innovation, and a moment that in his life could be called nothing less than mission critical. So let's go through a few of these letters. Let's talk about what our hero is facing in this moment. First, we have letters that he receives from his father, Alexander Melville Bell. He is frustrated with his son. What does he want Alexander Graham Bell to do? Well, he wants him to focus on his legacy. He wants his son to bring his own invention, visible speech, that's that system for teaching the deaf to speak, to the world. And he considers all of these other things that he's looking at to be just total distractions, wastes of time. In fact, he tells him that the best thing he could possibly do is just to sell out of this nonsense multiple telegraph business, focus on what matters, teaching the deaf to speak, bringing the invention of visible speech to the world. And this notion that his son has begun to talk about of a telephone, pure fantasy. By the way, the next time you want to say, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. I would prefer instead that you say, a bird in the hand, though smaller, is better than a score of big ones with their tails unsalted. I did not edit that. Totally going to say that. Let's talk about the letters that he's receiving from his sponsor, his boss. He is equally furious because he begrudges every moment that his young employee spends on anything but the multiple telegraph. So, teaching the deaf, visible speech, waste of my time. And don't talk to me about that telephone thing. Build the multiple telegraph. It's what I'm paying you for. Like, I rescued you. Get to work. It's also in this moment that Gardiner Hubbard realizes something that he is not particularly happy about, which is that Alexander Graham Bell is falling in love with Gardiner Hubbard's daughter. Remember, Alexander Graham Bell, a dirt poor immigrant. Gardiner Hubbard, a well-to-do businessman. Now, like all great businessmen, he does not shy away from using even this to his advantage. So, I'm afraid that from Mabel's own letters, we know that he tells Alexander Graham Bell that if you don't stop focusing on all those other things, you will never see my daughter again. Now, let's reflect upon the pressures that our dear hero feels in this moment. He feels first a very understandable desire to please his father, to honor his legacy. And by the way, the goal of teaching the deaf to speak, this is an altruistic and noble endeavor. Meanwhile, his only path to things like wealth and social status, things that matter a great deal to Alexander Graham Bell, is through this man, Gardiner Hubbard, and he is also the only path to the woman that he loves. All of these people pull Alexander in completely different directions, but they do have one thing in common, which is that every one of them is telling him to focus on anything except creating the telephone. What does our hero do in this moment? He builds a telephone. He creates something that will completely and utterly change the world forever. Now, just because it may be tempting at this moment to think of this man as someone with almost superhuman vision, let's take him down a couple of notches real quick. So, first, he was laboring, at least to some extent, upon a very important misconception. You see, Alexander Graham Bell, when he had started his work, early work on the telegraph and the telephone, had gotten a hold of a book written by a German scientist named Helmholtz. In that book, Alexander Graham Bell thought he had understood what Helmholtz had done. See, the problem was the book was written in German. Alexander Graham Bell didn't read German, but he tried to study the pictures and piece together the words, and what he thought Helmholtz had said was that he had successfully sent the sound of vowels, parts of speech, across a wire. And Alexander Graham Bell looked at this and said, fantastic. If he has sent vowels over a wire, then all I have to do is figure out how to send also the consonants, and I will have a working telephone. Helmholtz had done nothing of the kind. Alexander Graham Bell misunderstood the book. He mistranslated it. He proceeded to try and reproduce an experiment that had never been accomplished, successfully accomplishing it, and then so much more to create the telephone. In his own writings, he tells us that later, when he got a hold of a French translation of Helmholtz's book, he realized then his mistake, by this point having already reproduced Helmholtz's experiment for the first time. And he says in his own writings that had he not had that critical early misconception, he may have never began his work on the telephone, which tells you that often the belief that something is possible, even if that belief is incorrect, is often the better part of vision. Now, second is that Alexander Graham Bell, for all of his amazing vision, lacked a very important kind of vision, a very important kind of vision that would have to come from someone else in his life. See, here's the issue. in this moment, there is a grand opportunity for Alexander Graham Bell. The World's Fair, the Centennial exhibition, is about to take place in Philadelphia. And the World's Fair is a lot of things, but among them is it's a place where countries of the world come together and they present the greatest technological marvels for consideration by the world. It is a showcase of technological innovation. Alexander Graham Bell, who now at this point has a working telephone, can't be bothered to travel the short distance to Philadelphia to show it to people. He has made arrangements for his father's invention to be shown there. But he's gone back to teaching. He was probably tired. He had worked himself almost to death to create the telephone. And this opportunity was about to pass him by. It was Mabel Hubbard, now his fiancée, who corrected this. Here's how she did it. True story. She packed a bag for him secretly with a change of clothes and the telephone in it. Tells him in the morning before he goes off to teach that she's going to meet him that afternoon in the family carriage, and they're going to go for a little ride in the countryside. He says, that sounds great. So she picks him up after he's done teaching, and before he knows it, he's standing at the train station with his bag in one hand, a ticket in the other. He's arguing with his fiancée, I can't go to Philadelphia. What about my classes? What about... She stops him with a word, tells him that this is his moment, the moment when he must bring this invention to the world, turns her back and walks away. She's deaf. She understands him by reading lips. She is literally deaf to his complaints. Nice trick. What can he do in this moment? Well, he climbs dejectedly onto that train, travels to Philadelphia, presents the telephone to the world. It is an instant sensation. He shows it to people like the Emperor Dom Pedro of Spain. It is this moment, not Watson, I need you, but it talks, Dom Pedro's words, that the telephone becomes the sensation that we know today. It is this instant that it is brought to the world. It was Mabel Hubbard who realized that this was the time and the place where that could happen. This kind of vision, not the vision of the inventor, the vision of the person who understands the manner and the place in which something can be brought to the world, was a role that Mabel continued to play for all the years of her life in the Bell Telephone Company. And while we're on the subject of Mabel Hubbard, I'll mention that Mabel Hubbard, later Mabel Bell, was also known as the First Lady of Canadian Aviation, one of the most important pioneers in yet another fundamental field. So Mabel Hubbard, a deaf woman, accomplishes all these things. She deserves a talk all her own. I regret that we have to go forward instead. Now, I've told you two stories of vision. The vision of an inventor and the vision of the person who brought the invention to the world. I'm afraid now that I have to share with you a story of a complete lack of vision. See, in this instant, in this moment, the telephone is working. It's patented. This is a page from the first page of the first telephone patent. It is a worldwide sensation, talk on everyone's lips. And it's in this instant that this gentleman, Gardiner Hubbard, remember the guy with the money, he has a crisis of faith, a moment of concern. He's not completely sure that the Bell Telephone Company, this fledgling little creation that he has funded, has what it takes to bring this to the world. So in this moment, he gathers everything up. He brings the patents, he brings the telephone, and he goes to the offices of the Western Union Telegraph Company. And he meets with William Orton, the president of Western Union. And in this moment, he offers William Orton all of the rights to the telephone, the working device, all of the patents, forever, for a sum that in today's currency would be $5 million US. Think about that. if a venture capitalist today was offered all of the rights for something as transformative as a telephone for $5 million US today, William Orton turned him down. And although it is impossible to know exactly what he said in that meeting, he is commonly quoted as saying, "What use would I have for this electrical toy?" It was only about a year later that he realized the depth of his mistake. Perhaps he realized that with those words, he had cemented his legacy not as the leader of perhaps one of the most influential, one of the most important companies of the 19th century, but as the gentleman who made quite possibly the worst business decision in history. He offered a year later to purchase the same thing for a sum 20 times what he had been originally offered. But by that point, I'm afraid that the Western Union Company found that the Bell Telephone Company was no longer selling, and well on its way to dwarfing the impact that Western Union would ever have on this world. So, that concludes my third story of vision. And I'm going to turn a corner here, because vision is a wonderful and powerful thing. We've had a couple of examples of it just now, but it is not, in total, the qualities necessary to accomplish the kind of innovation that I'm talking about this morning. The next quality that we have to talk about, and the subject of our next story, is risk. A lot of us here know something about risk. I work for NASA. We do a lot of risky things, a lot of things that human lives depend upon and things that billion-dollar spacecraft depend upon. But quite a few of you deal with very risky things as well. When my life savings in a bank account depends on software, when the life of my mother in a hospital depends upon software, when just the entire livelihood of yourself and the people you work with depends on your software, you are taking enormous risks with your actions. It can feel paralyzing, it can feel terrifying. Perhaps that's how it felt in this moment, the moment when I believe that the sensation of risk was more keenly felt than at any other within the space agency.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
I am never going to get tired of listening to that. As inspiring as that speech was by John F. Kennedy at Rice University, he sort of seemed to leave out exactly how we were supposed to do that. Must be nice to be the president, huh? Just bang your fist on the table, and then someone else has got to go figure out how to cash the check. So I don't think it's a stretch, by the way, to suggest that even NASA didn't know how to do that when he made that speech. So where were they going to turn for inspiration? Where could they look for an idea about how to accomplish something so fanciful, so exciting that it had never been accomplished before? Well, I'm afraid to say that it seems like it may, at least to some extent, have come from here. This is Destination Moon, a charming, really quite quaint vision about how we could travel to the moon. Now, if you were to ask your 5-year-old, how would we go to the moon? Well, they probably would say something like this. Well, I would build a giant rocket. How big, honey? Well, huge. And I would get into my rocket, and I would fly it to the moon, and then I would land on the moon, and I would get out, and I would play with the rocks on the moon, and then I would get back into my giant rocket, and I would fly it back home again and land on Earth. It sounds good, right? It sounds simple, elegant in its simplicity. It seems that the simple approach to this must make sense. Well, it's not really too terribly surprising that that is basically what the first design for Apollo was. I am not joking. It's called the Nova. This is not a kid's drawing. This is a representation of the Nova rocket. The Nova was a behemoth. It was going to be enormous because, among other things, it had to lift this, another giant craft. The thing that was going to land on the moon was 4 stories tall. It had to be enormous because it was everything. It was the craft that would take us to the moon, land on the moon, launch from the moon, return to Earth. It had to be so much, became so big that it could not succeed. Now, I'll digress just momentarily because the Nova rocket, as I'm fond of pointing out, while it was huge, it was going to be even larger than the Saturn V rocket. This is the rocket that we ultimately used to go to the moon. Saturn V, when it was launched, was the tallest building in Florida. Well, okay, technically there was one larger building, and that is the building that held the Saturn V. But the Saturn V, this building, was rolled down a road and launched into space. Please reflect for me for a moment. We launched the tallest building in Florida into space. And as remarkable as that is, the Nova rocket was going to be even larger. But before we could get here, before we could arrive at the way that we would eventually accomplish this, I want to note that the Nova was backed and supported by some very influential people, including this gentleman. This gentleman is Wernher von Braun, an incredibly respected rocketeer and leader within NASA. He threw his weight behind the Nova rocket as the best way, the most likely way to succeed. Now, fortunately, there was a vocal minority that was led by this man, John C. Houbold. Now, John, he had a very different idea than Nova. His idea was that instead of launching that giant rocket, let's instead launch a 4-part reconfigurable spacecraft that would transform itself multiple times on the way to the moon and back. Now, even by today's standards, I would argue that this sounds like science fiction. I want you to imagine what it must have sounded like in 1960. It might account somewhat for the fact that John faced enormous resistance and challenges just to try to have his idea heard. John, who recently passed away, in his journals, in his papers, writes with scathing criticism of the challenges he faced to bring his idea to light, to share it with people. So in honor of John, and just to try to help you understand just how risky this approach looked, let's talk about the lunar orbit rendezvous method for getting to the moon and back. Now, we've already established that the Battlestar Galactica method of getting to the moon is out. So, just as a design exercise, let's go to the opposite extreme. Let's ask ourselves, what is the absolute smallest thing that you could possibly cram 3 human beings inside? I think you would probably get this. This, the Apollo command module. An exercise in what I would call spacecraft minimalism. There is almost no room in this thing, just enough room for those 3 astronauts. And it does have a critical problem that I believe your 5-year-old is in the back raising their hand saying, but it doesn't have a rocket engine, Daddy. Lousy spacecraft. So, it's not going anywhere on its own. You're going to need something like that. This is the Apollo service module. And it has quite a lot of things. Yes, it has that all-important rocket engine on the back. Ouch. It also contains a lot of consumables, and it docks on the back of the command module like that, and we call it the command service module at this point. Now, just in case you're imagining that suddenly now that the astronauts have got this stretched limo to hang out in, no, this is all unpressurized. There's no room back there for anybody. They're all still crammed up there in the front. Now, that's something that I think your 5-year-old would probably draw if you wanted to go to the moon, but unfortunately, it's not going to land on the moon. It's not built to accomplish that. For that phase of the mission, we're going to need something else. Specifically, we're going to need this. This is the Lunar Excursion Module, or the LEM. Now, this is what I would call a true spacecraft. With all those hard edges and all those spindly legs, this thing is just going to burn up in an atmosphere. Now, it's quite ideal, however, for the microgravity environment of the moon. Now, it gets docked onto the back of the command service module like this. Actually, a little bit more like that. Now, let's take a moment and ask ourselves how John C. Halbolt's presentation is going at this moment, because right before his big presentation, a guy stood up and said, all right, everybody, here's how we're going to go to the moon. We're going to build a giant rocket. We're going to fly it to the moon, land it, fly it back again. Any questions? Now, I'm wondering if at this moment, someone in the room might have kind of fidgeted a little bit, raised their hand and said, you know, John, it's really great that you came out here and explained this to us, but see, me and the other rocket scientist back here, we were talking, and we think if you turn on this here rocket engine, it's not going to be good for this part. And John says, oh, well, wait, hold on. No, you see, after we launch, we're going to undock this part and spin it around and redock it back to that part again in space. Well, they let him keep talking. And it's a good thing they did, because that is the cruise configuration of the Apollo spacecraft. That's how it flew to the moon. So, let's go to the moon. And if you permit me a moment of a little bit of theater, here we are at Earth. Sound effects. We're at the moon. Okay. And clearly, all of the silly business is over now, right, John? No more of that crazy stuff you're talking about. Nope, we're not done yet, because what's going to happen now is, well, we're in the second configuration of the spacecraft, but 2 astronauts from here are going to climb into here, leaving 1 astronaut behind here to stay in orbit and do science, which you have to agree is something of a letdown. Because while he just hangs out up there in lunar orbit, the other 2 guys get to pilot the sports car down to the surface of the moon to land. Now, momentary digression. All Apollo landings were accomplished manually. This you might know. What you may not know is that the spacecraft was quite capable of landing itself. I have a great deal of respect for astronauts. They are a lot of why I do today what I do. But see, the thing is that there was only really 1 astronaut who needed to land manually. That was the first astronaut to land on the moon, Neil Armstrong. And he did that because the area that we were trying to land had too many rocks in it. And so he went manual at the last moment. But you better believe that once Neil did that, there was not a fighter jock in our agency who was going to land automatically on the moon. Let the computers do that. All right, anyway, they get out of the spacecraft, they walk around, they pick up some rocks, they hit some golf balls, and then we break the spacecraft in half. Okay. It flies back up into orbit. We leave this part behind. And they fly around and find this poor guy and redock on the front of that. 2 astronauts climb from here back into here. Has it been up here? Kind of boring. We brought you some rocks. And at this point, it's time to detach these 2 modules. And I have to imagine that, by the way, at this moment, when there's 3 people in here, and hopefully nobody in here, that there was a careful count taking place right there. Because, like 1, 2, no, stop floating around. Like 1, 2, 3. There were 3 of us that came here, right? Because what they're going to do now is detach this part. This part tumbles away crashes into the moon and makes a giant hole for science. And now we're left with this. Anybody? I've lost count of the spacecraft configurations. Anyway, we've got this one which flies back to Earth again. Sound effects. And here we are back at the Earth. And at this moment, they get a call from Mission Control, which has to be a bit concerning to an astronaut who is floating in a tin can in space, because what they tell them to do is it's time to detach their rocket engine while they're in space. They do detach the rocket engine. This thing spirals away, burns up in the Earth's atmosphere, and we are left with this. From the largest building in Florida down to that little thing, which moves around the Earth and then slowly floats down to the surface of the ocean, splashes, 3 astronauts climb out, very thankful to be alive. The end. Let's bring that back again. That is not something that I would call low risk. It seems so complicated. We've been taught through conventional wisdom that simplicity is how you reduce risk. Complexity means more risk. That's a pretty limited way to think about risk and about innovation. I would prefer to say, in the words of Ward Cunningham, that this was the simplest thing that could possibly work. Something you'll see a lot of, I believe, in how we explore the planets. The way that we landed the Curiosity Mars Rover just 2 years ago did not look simple, but it was the simplest thing we could come up with that we think could work. That is the kind of simplicity we need to look for. And when we're confronting risk, we don't attempt to solve it through simplicity. We look for that elusive, simplest thing that could possibly work. Now, I have one more story to tell. This story is a little different because it's about me and because it's about failure. My business at JPL is the control of spacecraft and robots. I've built a wide variety of those kinds of tools. I've worked on a number of missions. I've led the organization that is responsible for all the people and the software and the processes that command 15 missions at JPL. It began for me on my very first mission with the Mars Polar Lander mission in 1999. I remember the landing day very well. I gathered with other members of the team. We prepared for the 7 minutes of terror, that period of time during which the spacecraft is trying to land itself autonomously on the surface. The difference was this was extra scary because our spacecraft was not going to be capable of communicating with us during the descent. We had to take that feature out because of money. So what happens is that the spacecraft begins its entry and we stop hearing from it, as expected. And we wait tensely as it goes through the terrifying series of events that bring it to the surface. And hear nothing more. And I want to explain to you that when we lose a spacecraft like this, it's not as if the spacecraft calls back to us and says, oops, sorry guys, problems, I'm failing now. Thanks for trying. We just didn't hear anything. Now, in this circumstance, we don't get to just throw up our hands and give up. Because you know what? A lot of things can go wrong when a spacecraft is landing, and not all of them are fatal to the mission. The computer could have reset right after landing. The computer's clock could be fouled up, in which case it would try to talk to us the next time it feels the sunlight on its solar panels. It could have lost track for a bit about where Earth was, and then it would try to search the skies for the planet, trying to reestablish contact with us. So because of this, we have to try over and over and over again. Long after the cameras and the reporters are gone, long after everyone has stopped paying attention, we turn our dishes and our thoughts upwards in what can only be described as an expression of hope that we'll hear something back from the spacecraft. It's a little like having your heart broken over and over and over again. How can you do something like that, point a dish to the heavens, and not feel hope that something might talk back? And it never did. It was that experience that taught me that despite what a few Hollywood movies might tell you, at NASA, failure absolutely is an option. What rose out of the ashes of Mars Probe Lander? The next project I worked on, the Fido Rover. What do you do when you fail at something hard, like sending a lander to Mars? Conventional wisdom would have us do something simpler. We did not do that. We got more ambitious. Build a rover, not just like the rover that in 98 had driven around the vicinity of the lander, but a rover that could drive over the horizon, that could be a true explorer on the surface of Mars. On the Fido project, which is a rover that never went to Mars, we learned everything that we needed to learn about how to do that on Earth so that we were ready when the call came to build a rover. And then when the call came, that almost never comes, build 2 of them. These would become Spirit and Opportunity. And when we roll the clock forward to the launch day, I have to say that the launch of spacecraft like this is something of only a minor event to people like me who work in spacecraft operations. Because, you see, the hardest part of our job is not at the launch or even the cruise through space. It's what happens when we get to the destination that's really difficult. And a little-known fact is that we're writing the software for controlling the spacecraft when it gets there while it is traveling there. In fact, we are still working on the software that will run on board the rover while it is traveling there. We don't like to do it this way. We do it this way to save money. So once that spacecraft launched successfully, all we really did is we ran over, crowded around the television, watched it, okay, great, and then rushed back to the desk and get back to coding because that thing is going to Mars. And the motion of the planets will not change to accommodate your slipped development schedule. So get back to work. So the next year, rather challenging, then brings us to this moment, January 4th, 2004. Another incredibly tense day. It was impossible for me not to think back to my last experience of entry, descent, and landing, the loss of a spacecraft. I found myself sitting right there, sitting in front of a console in our Mission Control Center, surrounded by 100 or so scientists that I knew so well by that point. People who, some of them had spent close to a decade of their lives building the instruments and building the scientific plan that brought us to this moment. We're waiting for the very first images from the surface of Mars. I'm sitting in front of a piece of software that I led the development of. And sure, I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, what could we possibly see in this moment? We had no idea what we would see in that first image of the surface of Mars. We know so little about that place. But I got to confess, a great deal of what I was thinking about was, I really hope my software doesn't crash right now. Funny thing, as the data starts to arrive from Mars, you can hear it. What do I mean by that? The data travels a long way, and even once it gets to JPL, it's got a few more steps to go through. You see, it first goes to the room of people who are monitoring the Deep Space Network, and so through the wall where their offices are, you hear shouting and cheering, and then next door, the room where they're processing the data products and making them ready for us to look at, shouting and cheering there, and then all of a sudden, the room erupts. I open up that first image, and we see this, which even now is the most important picture to me of my professional career. Because in 15 years of working in Mars exploration, what this picture means to me is it's not just the success that it represents. In fact, I don't think I could feel so connected to the success that it represents if I had not had that little lesson in failure that preceded it. It's taught me that you cannot have successes of innovative projects like Spirit and Opportunity without some failures like the Mars Polar Lander. Interestingly enough, an organization absolutely can have only failures. And nothing will make that more likely than choosing not to innovate when you face failure for the first time. Now, it may sound like that the secret to this mission-critical innovation business is all you got to have is vision and risk and then get lucky. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you're going to build your company or your project, even yourself, around the idea of being a visionary risk taker, that you must plan for failure. It is an inexorable part of innovation. If you are building your company, your project, around the idea that you're going to be visionary and take risks and never fail, then you already have. And I think the people that I talked about in the stories earlier in this talk would say the very same thing. And I'm going to leave you with just 2 more quotes from a couple of them. Because I think you have a great opportunity in events like this. I love events like this, especially multidisciplinary, multi-topic events like this, because it gives you the chance to do what Alexander Graham Bell says there at the top. And I hope you will. I hope you will take the opportunity to not go to the talk that you probably should. Go to a talk that you know nothing about. Talk to somebody new at every opportunity that you have, because we spend all of our time focusing on the immediacy of what's next, the very next thing. Spend this time on diving into the woods. I look forward to hearing what you come back with from that journey. Thank you very much for your attention.